The president of Ecuador moves the seat of power away from the capital as mobilizations continue to be met with police repression. Protests outside the Supreme Court in Colombia as the former president Alvaro Uribe is called in for questioning. And Trinidad and Tobago's government presents a $53 billion TT fiscal package.
Be eligible for the minimum.
Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. People in Ecuador continue to mobilize against the government of President Lenin Moreno. Protests have been ongoing since last Thursday and started after the president imposed a number of IMF-backed austerity measures, the most controversial of which was the end of state subsidies for regular fuel and diesel, increasing the price of the latter by well over 100%. In light of the mobilizations, President Moreno moved his government to Guayaquil. State institutions suspended most activities on Tuesday as schools remain closed for a fourth day. The authorities have also announced that 570 people have been detained so far as social media continues to be flooded with images of police brutality. Now, as the first indigenous marchers from the south, along with other protesters, arrived in the historic center of Quito on Monday night, the police met them with volleys of tear gas. Some demonstrators responded with stones, but the police soon cleared the Santo Domingo Square with more tear gas and officers on horseback. Indigenous marchers from the northern highlands got a very different reception when they reached the low-income neighborhood of Calderon in the north of Quito. They were cheered by local residents who had collected food and other supplies for them. And after the repression in the center of the city, the indigenous protesters from the south were also given a meal by social movements who turned out to welcome them. Indigenous marchers have continued to arrive in the capital on Tuesday morning. Thousands made their way through the community of Carcelén on the northern edge of Quito. They were heading for the center to join those already there. Our correspondent in Quito, Denise Herrera, brings us more.
Hello, we are at the Arbolito Park, one of the main parks in Quito. As you can see behind me, the indigenous movements are here. They are in the 6th day of their strike. They are against the latest economic measures announced by President Lenin Moreno. We know that more indigenous women are coming to Quito, and also they are going to the Guayaquil city. As you can see, they are here gathering at Arbolito Park. They want to go to Carantolet Palace, the government palace. As we have known also, the authorities are still in Guayaquil. They are against the latest economic measure, and they said that they will continue with their strike until President Moreno stops with economic measures.
That was our correspondent Denise Herrera with that report. Now we stay in Ecuador, where President Lenin Moreno gave a televised address late on Monday to announce he has transferred the seat of government to the city of Guayaquil after having abandoned the capital Quito. He went on to assert that reported incidents of violence indicate the protests are organized in order to bring down his administration.
Countrymen, I've moved to the city of Guayaquil, and I've also transferred the seat of government to the city in accordance with the Constitution. I've always put the peace and tranquility of Ecuadorians before my own well-being. What's happened over these days in Ecuador isn't a protest of discontent because of a government decision. The violence, vandalism, and looting shows that here there is an organized political effort to destabilize the government and an end to constitutional and democratic order.
President Moreno also blamed his predecessor Rafael Correa, a number of other former Ecuadorian ministers, and the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, for the anti-austerity protests across Ecuador.
Do you really believe that it's a coincidence that Correa, Virgilio Hernández, Patiño, and Pavón traveled just weeks ago to Venezuela together? Together with Maduro, they activated their plan to destabilize us.
Indigenous protesters have also arrived in the city of Guayaquil, the financial hub of Ecuador, where President Lenin Moreno has holed himself up. In response to this, the roads leading to the city's wealthiest neighborhood have been blocked by authorities. This as Guayaquil has also been rocked by anti-government protests in recent days.
As we didn't have any official information and the indigenous marches were coming from the highlands and there are several entrances to Guayaquil, we didn't know where they would arrive. So we protesters from the Recreo and Duran came here to the bridge. People knocked down the lampposts to block the road to cars. The police, as usual, used force, fired tear gas to stop us from moving forward and blocking the road.
Let's hear now from our correspondent in Guayaquil, Carla Gonzalez.
We are at the Puente de la Unidad Nacional, the National Unity Bridge, which connects the main provinces, the main cities outside of Guayaquil to the main port, which is the city. Yesterday we saw how different tanks from the municipality of Guayaquil and the military, buses and a lot of soldiers as well, they were here blocking the way because they thought the indigenous march was going to enter the city through this bridge, the main bridge connecting the city. But as we saw, they entered through Via Daule, which is another way to enter the city. They are expecting to reach the 9 de Octubre Avenue, the main avenue inside the city. And they are also expecting a national strike to happen tomorrow in the main cities, Guayaquil and Quito. We see that these tanks are still on the bridge. They haven't closed the traffic altogether. It's still a bit slow. But they are continuing here in Duran as well, the city connecting the bridge. We saw several policemen with horses. We saw what was left of yesterday's protest, because yesterday was the main protest day. They burnt tires. There were some looting happening in Duran, one of the main cities. Of course, we remember that people that work and live in Duran also travel to Guayaquil, the main port city in Ecuador. We also heard from the mayor of Guayaquil, Cynthia Viteri. She said that she was against gas prices going up because it affects the fare prices for the buses inside the city and outside of the city. So we are also expecting her to speak on what happened yesterday here. As we remember, President Lenin Moreno gave a press conference yesterday, a recorded press conference, where he spoke about the indigenous march arriving to the main cities, Guayaquil and Quito. He rejected the violence that has erupted due to this march, which the indigenous population, indigenous communities organizing the march are saying that these are not part of their communities. These are people that have taken advantage of the protest to loot and to steal for several businesses. We did a whole a trip around the city, the main streets in the city, in the center of the city. We saw several businesses that were closed. Today, as we remember, classes are suspended. No one is going to school, schools, primary schools and universities as well. So we are here expecting more information. As soon as we have it, we'll come back to you.
That was Carla Gonzalez in Guayaquil with that report. Shifting gears now, Colombia's former president Alvaro Uribe is being questioned by the Supreme Court over alleged witness tampering. Protesters gathered outside the court ahead of the hearing. They say Uribe, as a senator and the unofficial head of the governing party, is partly responsible for the murder of hundreds of community leaders and former FARC guerrillas. The case against the former president has to do with his alleged involvement with right-wing paramilitaries.
I never thought that frankly defending honor in my love for Colombia, with respect for citizens, and in accordance with the Constitution, would create these judicial difficulties for me.
Our correspondent Hernan Tobar is outside the Supreme Court in Bogota.
We are outside the court where the senator and former president Alvaro Uribe arrived a short while ago. I'll let the camera show you what's happening here. There are groups of human rights activists, groups of Uribe supporters, but above all, people who are demanding justice and that Senator Uribe be investigated, not only for his links with paramilitaries, but also for his connection with the so-called false positives, where civilians were kidnapped and murdered by the army and then presented as guerrillas killed in combat. Senator Uribe was originally called to appear at a courtroom in the north of the capital, but for security reasons, the police said they had to move the hearing to the main Supreme Court building here, in the center of Bogotá. Senator Uribe was called to answer a list of 100 questions presented by the judges relating to the accusation that he tampered with witnesses and manipulated evidence.
A bill promoted by right-wing parties in Colombia proposes setting limits on public protests. Human rights organizations are opposing the bill as it violates constitutional and international norms.
Demonstrations like this are a target of security bodies belonging to the Colombian government. The defense minister and the interior minister agree that social movements must be regulated by means of a bill that will be presented by right-wing political parties in Congress and that aims at setting limits on public demonstrations.
We need to create punitive measures for social protests because the way public forces are attacked isn't appreciated by citizens. Civil servants are ridiculed. In some cases, they try to set them on fire and attack them with all kinds of tools, and in some cases with firearms. This requires punitive measures.
Human rights organizations argue that if this project were to be adopted, it would be violating Colombia's political constitution. They say the bill is actually seeking to provide ways to violently suppress all sorts of protests, as well as stigmatize social movements that are growing in the country.
If we are going to talk about building a constitutional norm or any other kind of norm about protest, it must be one that guarantees protests can take place and that they are not limited or criminalized, and one that doesn't promote police violence.
One of the most controversial aspects of this project is the possibility that under the presumption of acts of violence or vandalism, public forces may force their way into educational institutions, something that, according to the educational community, violates the principle of university autonomy. Meanwhile, the students' community is also demanding investigations into the anti-riot squad after the death of students during protests.
The student movements have specifically had to endure many murders. At the hands of the SMAT, student leaders like in the case of Oscar Salas, who was murdered inside this university by a non-conventional weapon used by the SMAT during a confrontation.
In the next days, the project aiming at regulating demonstrations in Colombia will be presented in Congress for debate and approval. Meanwhile, students have been protesting, saying that on October 10th, they will mobilize on the streets to request the abolishment of the anti-riot squad and the investigation of acts of corruption inside public universities.
We'll take a short break now. When we come back, Jamaica's Prime Minister has once again emphasized the vulnerability of small island developing states in the face of the global climate crisis. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. With a general election due next year, Trinidad and Tobago's government has presented what many are calling a sweetheart budget. The $53 billion TT dollar fiscal package was delivered by Finance Minister Com Imber on Monday. He announced an increase in the minimum wage from $15 to $17.50 per hour starting from December 2019. Persons employed in state community enhancement programs also got a 15% pay hike. farming will become a tax-free industry, with all fees and duties on all inputs for farmers to be removed, and a ban on the importation of styrofoam in the food industry, and the use of plastic water bottles in government offices will take effect at the start of 2020.
I now propose that daily paid workers in the public service with an appropriate minimum length of service be eligible for the minimum public service pension of $3,500 per month. I propose to offer, in the first instance, $3 billion in interest-bearing government bonds.
Meanwhile, opposition leader Kamala Persad-Bissessar, in her response to the 2019-2020 budget, told the government what the country needs is jobs.
How to create new revenue streams and create new jobs and foreign exchange. That is what we should have heard here today. That is what the minister should have been telling us today. How do we create jobs? What am I going to do as Minister of Finance for job creation, for revenue generation, and for forex issues to be dealt with?
Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holness has stressed that small island developing states, or SIDS, are under immediate threat of climate change. He made the comment while giving the keynote address at the GCF Private Investment for Climate Conference in Incheon, South Korea on Monday. PM Holness drove home the point that more must be done to tackle the crisis.
Climate-related shocks, whether sharp and swift hurricanes or lingering and debilitating droughts, have a long-term effect, particularly on the economic growth trajectory and public debt of small island developing states and less developed countries. The problem is compounded by the fact, as you all know, that small island developing states, notwithstanding that by virtue of size, we are the least cause of the problem, but by virtue of our geography, we are among the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. But we are also, by virtue of the state of development of our economy and public institutions, we are amongst the least able to respond.
Guyana's President David Granger says the protection of indigenous land, languages and other rights remains a priority of his government. Granger issued the assurance while addressing over 200 village leaders at the opening of the 13th National Toshaos Council. There are 9 indigenous nations that settled across the 10 administrative regions in Guyana. The Toshaos Council is the highest representative body for indigenous peoples. President Granger urged Toshaos village leaders to set aside their differences and work together to reduce some of the social ills threatening their communities.
Work together to reduce the incidence of alcoholism, incest, murder, non-communicable diseases, people trafficking, prostitution, substance abuse, teenage pregnancy and suicide in certain communities. Antisocial behavior undermines the cultural fabric of communities and lowers everyone's quality of life.
The president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, has denounced violent threats coming from Colombia. President Maduro said that the Bolivarian Republic wants peace, sovereignty, calm, life and development, meaning an orange alert had to remain in effect along Venezuela's border with Colombia.
I've decided that the orange alert will stay in effect, phase 2. No one group can be in Venezuelan territory. That's why we have the powerful Bolivarian National Armed Forces.
Honduras opposition and social forces are coming together to demand the resignation of President Juan Orlando Hernandez. U.S. prosecutors say jailed Mexican drug leader Joaquin El Chapo Guzman gave $1 million to the brother of the Honduran president, a bribe that was meant to reach the country's leader for campaign financing.
President Hernandez, who enjoys the staunch support of the Trump administration, has said the accusations were less serious than Alice in Wonderland. But prosecutors in New York tell a different story. They alleged that El Chapo personally gave the money in bribes to Juan Antonio Tony Hernandez, the president's brother, who in turn used his government connections to smuggle US-bound cocaine through Honduras.
It's devastating for a country when its president is being accused of scheming against an entire institutional structure that allowed drug trafficking to take place from South to North of America.
After the first hearings against Tony Hernandez, Honduras Attorney General and the Supreme Court have failed to say whether any investigation would be launched into the allegations against the Honduran president and his brother.
There has been no answer from the state attorneys so far. There are no answers neither from the armed forces nor the police. They're just silent. This is what's happening right now in the country, and it's so unfortunate because the Honduran people are the ones who are suffering.
Various opposition forces are starting to mobilize. And now they are calling for mass protest action to demand the resignation of Juan Orlando Hernandez and his co-conspirators.
As a result of this, opposing political and social forces are calling for the people to exercise their right to protest until the narco dictatorship falls down. We will let you know the details in time.
Interest from various social and political sectors have been mobilizing to hold mass protests against Juan Orlando Hernandez's government.
There's been major uncertainty in our country. The entire opposition needs to join forces. We can't have a leader who's been accused of drug trafficking by the New York Southern District Attorney. I believe that Juan Orlando Hernandez's resignation is crucial for the entire country.
The president has been labeled a co-conspirator, though he has not been charged. During the trial against his brother, former mayor Alexander Ardon testified that the president received funds that facilitated drug trafficking, while providing protection to Ardon and his family.
Coming up, the bodies of 13 African migrants have been recovered and 17 are still missing after shipwreck off the coast of Cameroon. We'll have details after this.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en ahí.
Dot in the eye. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. Search operations continue for 17 missing African migrants a day after the bodies of 13, all women, were recovered following the latest shipwreck off the coast of Lampedusa. Coffins were lined up on the port as bodies were brought to shore. The migrant vessel, which was carrying more than 50 people, capsized in bad weather. 21 migrants survived the sinking of the boat, but many are still not accounted for, including a number of children. A Cameroonian survivor recalled the traumatic experience.
Among the survivors, there are only 3 boys, and the others are at the bottom of the sea. I find it hard to talk about. I feel like I'm suffocating, and I do not have the strength to explain things better. There were 2 newborns and 2 minors who fell into the sea and who did not survive. Many women died. We had 12 survivors.
In other news, the son of South African former President Jacob Zuma has appeared before the Commission of Inquiry seeking to unearth corruption. Duduzane Zuma has been implicated as a fixer for the controversial Gupta family. This family is alleged to have a hand in making executive decisions while President Jacob Zuma was in office. Our correspondent Matuba Malachi was following those proceedings.
First, it was his father, former President Jacob Zuma, in the hot seat at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. It didn't go so well, with the former president's counsel threatening to pull out of proceedings. Months later, it's now the turn of his son, Duduzane Zuma.
Mr. Tony Gupta is a business partner of mine. Yes. And he's also a very dear and close friend.
Zuma Jr. had to respond to allegations that he was a crucial link between government and the controversial Gupta family. Allegations leveled against him include a former deputy minister being offered a finance minister post and thousands of dollars in kickbacks if he agreed. But the young Zuma says he feels prejudiced by some questions put to him.
This was raised in the media. There was media statements put out. The man went on TV and said whatever he needed to say. I'm not taking away from why he did it. I don't know. He did what he had to do. Good for him. I have no issues with that. Now, what I'm saying is, it's the first time I'm being asked this question.
During his appearance months ago, former President Jacob Zuma also denied that the Gupta family were involved in selecting members of his cabinet. He, however, admitted that the Guptas were indeed his friends and business associates of his son Duduzane. But the young Zuma was defensive throughout the proceedings.
There were more denials than concessions in Duduzane Zuma's testimony at the state capture inquiry, but we expect to see more pressure being put on him as days go by, because he will be cross-examined by lawyers of people who implicated him in serious allegations of corruption. Amatiwa Mahlachi in Johannesburg for Telesur.
We move now to China, where authorities in Hong Kong warn that protest violence in the special administrative region have reached critical levels.
Riotous level of violence has been escalating without showing any sign of abating from week to week and has reached a very critical level. Since the prohibition on face covering regulation came into effect on Saturday, up to this morning, we have arrested 77 people, consisting of 50 males and 27 females, aged between 12 and 41 years old.
U.S. President Donald Trump has warned he would obliterate Turkey's economy if it took action in Syria that he considered off limits. Trump tweeted the warning after he was criticized for pulling 50 U.S. troops from Syria's northeast border on Sunday, with Kurdish special forces calling it a stab in the back. A day later, his warning to Turkey appears to be aimed at placating critics who accused him of abandoning the Syrian Kurds. The decision drew criticism from Democrats and a rebuke from some of Trump's fellow Republicans in Congress. And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. For our viewers in Africa, remember you can find us on Starsa channel 461 in South Africa and channel 539 in Nigeria. And join us on social media for Telesur English. I'm Doris Polo. Thank you for watching.